Good afternoon, folks, and thanks for joining part two of this two-part series webinar. If you joined us last week, you would have seen part one on working with layers, and this is really an extension of that. So last week was really about the basics, and this week we can go into a few more specific functions, cloning, healing, luminosity masking for one, and a few other bits and pieces. Before we come to that, if you're listening on YouTube or Facebook, welcome to you guys. If you're inside our webinar room, welcome to you as well. For those of you on YouTube and Facebook, feel free to ask your questions there as well, as I will see them. And we've got people hanging out on the chat there as well. If you are inside the webinar room, and if you want to ask a question, just make sure you put it in the Q&A. That just keeps it separate from the chat and makes it a bit easier to identify as a question. And if you'd like to hide the chat and get a bit more room, you can hit that down arrow and then you'll get more space to see Capture One. So let's get started. Now, this is the first stream on a new computer. It went all right this morning. I did forget a couple of things, which lucky for you, I won't bore you with, but are now fixed for this broadcast. So fingers crossed, everything should work quite nicely. So what we're going to talk about today is healing, cloning, a bit on luminosity masking, and then different ways to adjust masks, like refining a mask, feathering a mask, copying masks, and so on. That should take us about 45 minutes, depending on how chatty you are, and that should do it. So let's dive in straight away with two options, healing and cloning, which is essentially ways to repair an image, add some pixels from one spot to another. Very simple to use. So let's just run through the different options. So going over to our layers panel. So over here on the left-hand side, the last two, or second to last and the third to last icons here, are centered around healing and cloning. Slightly different operation between the two. Healing is generally used for repairing, clone is just for a like-for-like copy. So let's look at the healing first. Now generally we'll run through a few examples, we've got some up here. Generally healing is used to get rid of blemishes or marks that you don't want to appear in the picture. So if I grab my healing brush first of all and right click, you'll see that the options that you get are pretty similar to what you were used to with just a simple draw mask brush. Size, hardness, opacity, and flow. So no real massive changes there. So if I wanted to get rid of this mark on the track, for example, when I'm healing and cloning, I tend to extensively use the shortcut. Let's just budge that keyboard over a bit. The shortcut to change the size of the cursor key. Oh, let's just get rid of that one. That was an unintentional click. The size of the brush cursor, sorry. So if I just put the cursor over here on the tire so you can see it better. So if I hold down Control and Option and drag left and right, then that will change the size of the cursor. Up and down, that will change the hardness. So Control, Option, click, drag. If you're on a PC, instead of click, drag, it's a right click, drag. But that's something I use a lot more when I'm healing and cloning, purely because that's a faster way to change the size. So if we wanted to get rid of this blemish, draw a mask, and away you go. Simple as that. Nothing hugely technical to really talk about. One thing I will point out with the healing brush is that, as well as kind of copying pixels from one spot to another, it's doing some adjustments to the luminosity and color. So even if I dragged the source point and stuck it on top of the tire here, you'll see it's actually trying to blend that color and luminosity in, but obviously that's not a good place or a good source point, because we've now got kind of tire marks on it. So obviously somewhere there will be better. So there is a bit of an intelligence going on as well. Let's look at another basic example. Obviously, if we wanted to get rid of, let's just reset our layers tool so we can get rid of our dot there, dot there. The reason why I've picked this one is if we look at this dot like so, if I just get rid of that blemish, then obviously that doesn't look super realistic because we've got the hard edge of the tire. So there's nothing to stop you picking up the source point and then dragging it to somewhere that makes more sense and gives you a better result. Generally, the automatic choice of the source point works pretty well. So it's not something you'll find yourself needing to do a huge amount of the time. So again, if we go for this one, let's just zoom out a little bit. We've got a mark down on the wall right next to me down here. So if I just make my heel brush a bit bigger and get rid of that, then Capture One's picked a spot just right behind my head, of course. So let's hide me. And again, that automatic point was absolutely fine. You get the idea. Now, if you're doing, oh, there's a little one up here as well. So if we're doing multiple points, then you can find the viewer gets a little bit on the busy side. So let's go to somewhere where we might add a few more heel points. So first of all, again, I'd use that shortcut to, helps if I'm in Capture One, I'd use that shortcut to make my cursor a bit smaller and then just draw over this spot like so. And then there's no limit to the number of points that you can make. I think there's an eyelash up here somewhere. Doesn't have to be a circular shape that you can draw. We can just draw, you know, that little eyelash in there, there's an eyelash here, there's a little mark there, and so on. So you can just go nuts and then go healing and cloning like so. Now, if you're doing a lot on a particular spot, then you might find all these arrows get a little bit frustrating, so, or in the way at least. So two things you can do. We can simply move our cursor off the viewer and then they momentarily hide. So it just gives you the ability to quickly check what's going on. Secondly, we can right click and say display arrows, or just take that check mark off, and now we're not going to see any arrows at all. So if you are doing a spot that's a bit busier, let's just get rid of that hair, then it will disappear, but the arrows aren't shown. So you might find, especially doing a job like this, that the source point selection is so reliable that you don't really need to worry about it. Right click, bring them back like so. You can set up a shortcut for that, which might make a lot of sense if you're doing, you know, this kind of subject and you want to turn them on and off quickly. So if we go to our edit keyboard shortcuts, and then in our search tool, if we just type arrow, it's the easiest way to find it. And we can say display, heal and clone arrows, and then you can pick and choose any shortcut that you would like. So the same question from David and Tim. Any chance that the source point will always be held inside of a crop? Not currently, because Capture One is looking at, oh, hi Ian, not currently, as Capture One is looking at the entire photo. So you might come across the situation, which I totally agree with you is less than fortunate, that if you do have a crop, as an example, and then I healed here and it chose something outside of the crop area, I wouldn't be able to move it unless I readjusted the crop. So no change there in that respect, but I totally understand there could be a better way to do it. So that's healing. Pretty straightforward. Nothing too complex about that. I would also say if you want to heal from a specific point, now the only thing we've been looking at really is dots so far, and sometimes you might like to get rid of something a little bit bigger. So let's just reset once more, grab our heal brush, use our shortcut to make it a bit bigger, and then let's zap this person here as an example. And then Capture One picks its source point. But if you want to pre-select the source point, let's just reset that, then there's nothing to stop you. Because if you know, okay, the best source point is going to be XYZ, wherever, you can hold your Option key down and say, I want to choose here. And then as soon as I start brushing, then Capture One's going to use that source point as well. Once again, if we wanted to delete that source point, we've just got to select it till it goes orange on that circle, and then hit backspace on our keyboard, and it goes away. Or of course, you can reset the entire layers tool with the reset button up here. All right, let's just check for questions. Let's see, Q&A tab over here on the webinar. How does heal and clone compare to the spot removal tool? Good question. So there's also an older tool, if you like, called spot removal down here. Couple of important distinctions. Spot removal tool is limited to 99 spots. There is no limit on healing and cloning. The spot removal tool is only a circle shape, so you can't do lines or anything like that. I would say the success rate of the healing and cloning tool is far superior, to the point where I don't even use the spotting tool anymore. So I tend to forget it's there, to be honest. So I can't really think of a time when I would choose the old spot tool over healing and cloning. Healing and cloning tends to be a bit faster too. You might be thinking, then why is it still there? If you have legacy photos before the healing and cloning tool was actually created, and we took away that tool, you might be upset that we've then removed a bunch of spots on your tool. But at some point, I can imagine there's not much use for that particular tool anymore. Okay, Querfeldwald, that's a tough name to say. I hope I said it correctly. Is there a workaround to get a second heal layer mask? Yes. Well, remember, you only really need one, but we are going to talk about a reason where you might need two. And you can easily do that. You could have 10 layers of different heal layers if you wished. Okay, and I'm going to pick one more question over here. Does the heal mask have to be the first mask? I have the problem if an adjustment is over an adjustment mask. Doesn't matter where the heal layer is in the stack, to be honest. There could be an issue with luminosity masks, which we'll talk about when we come on to that. So hope that makes sense. Okay. Kevin, how do I remove a Mini Cooper with a branch hanging in front of the car? Good question. Without seeing the picture, I wouldn't know. That's a very specific question. Okay, right, moving on. So we looked at healing. I think you'll agree that's all pretty straightforward. What about cloning? So that's slightly different. Lovely panorama here from my buddy Chris out in Alaska. That was stitched just using this handheld compendium of pictures. Not too far, like so, to get this really nice chilly panorama out in Alaska. And cloning is really copying like for like pixels. So remember, the healing brush had those edits to the luminosity and color. Cloning is just a straight copy. So before we come to Chris's picture, if we just find a person with our clone stamp tool, let's just zoom in on one. The main difference is with the clone brush is that you must set the source point. There's no automatic source point decisions made by Capture One. And it's the same as before. You use your Option key to choose my source point, and then wherever you start masking, you're going to end up with an exact like for like copy, like so. But there's no adjustment to luminosity or anything like that whatsoever. So if I drag it and pick this guy, then you can see that difference in the color and luminosity over there. So it's just a like for like copy. So a very different operation to how the healing brush works. Okay, let's go back to our nice panorama. And what's the use case for using the clone brush? To be honest, I haven't found many, but that's also a little bit dependent on the kind of work you're doing as well. So what I found the clone brush useful for is putting catch lights or adding a catch light to someone's eye. If perhaps you've done an outdoor portrait and you've got a catch light in one eye but not the other, it tends to look a bit on the dead side. So just cloning in a tiny bit of catch light can make a world of difference. And in this situation on Chris's panorama, I noticed that we've got a light bulb out like so. So there's a little bit of inconsistency with the lighting. Now, you might not care, but I thought, well, in this case, I'd actually like to light up our pylon here. So I'm going to grab my clone brush. And if you remember, we have to set our source point. I'm going to zoom in super close so it's more accurate. I'm going to set our source point on this light and then go over to this one and then just literally cloning the top of the tower like so. Now I'd probably even do this a little bit smaller, so I'm going to let's just get rid of that layer, do it again. So first of all, I've got pen pressure on, which I don't want, and I want to make that smaller and softer so we don't get any hard edges. So option click once, and then go over here, and then we can just drop our headlights onto that shot. Now if it's not quite in the right place, we can actually use our cursor keys to nudge it. So on the keyboard, just using left and right, you'll see if I give this a couple of taps, you can start to see, oh, I'll just hide that for a second. So you'll see if I use my cursor keys, it moves the source point by a tiny amount. So then I could align my telegraph pole a bit better, like so. So now we've got our lit pole like so, which, you know, works nicely with the rest of the picture. So for me, there's very few cases for clone brushing, but as I said, catch lights, situation like this, if you want to add, let's say in a wildlife scene, you've got a bunch of flying birds and you want to add a few more birds, fish, something like that. Obviously, as it's like for like, it can't be super obvious, but there are uses for it. Okay, don't forget, you can also play around with, oh, we cropped this one, didn't we? Let's just make the crop a bit bigger so we're not cropping anything out. You can also play with the opacity on layers as well. And going back to the question from Mr. Wold, is there a workaround to get a second heal layer mask? The only time you really want to do this is if you were going to play around with the opacity. So we've done various healing on this layer already, but by having a lower opacity, it can be interesting to try to get rid of blemishes on a larger scale and so on. Now, I haven't tried it with this photo, I didn't think to, but let's give it a go anyway. So if we long press on our plus button over here, we can add additional heal layer, because the layer determines what kind of layer it is. Is it an adjustment layer? Is it a heal layer? Or is it a clone layer? So I'm going to attempt, and let's just see if it works on this. So quite often you have, you know, darker skin under your eyes. I certainly do. And sometimes a heal layer can work quite nicely to remove that. So let's just draw a full opacity mask under here like that. It should probably be a bit softer, actually. Let's undo that and make that nice and soft and a bit smaller. And then draw that mask like so. Now Caption's going to pick a source point which is not appropriate, so let's move that up here. And that looks pretty unrealistic, right? I'm just going to add a little bit to it there. So if you want to add to, deliberate mistake, if you want to add to an existing source slash heal point, select it first, and then Capture One won't try and auto select a new one. So we've done an adjustment there which looks very unrealistic, but if we pull our opacity down, then we can kind of bring that up a little bit and just lessen the effect like so. So Mr. Wold, that's why I would have more than one heal layer if I wanted to have different opacities. So if you don't want to heal something, if you just want to lessen the effect a bit, a few months back there was a seascape, like an overhead drone shot, and there were some things underwater, and healing them got rid of them nicely, but actually pulling the opacity back meant they showed through a little bit, but they weren't distracting anymore. So you can certainly do that. All right, can I rename the heal layers? Yeah, you can rename any layer. So we could call this eyes, we could call this cleanup just by double clicking on it like so. And that's important, so you know exactly what's going on. Limitation spotted by Freddie, you can't clone parts, excuse me, you can't clone parts of one picture to another. So you're working on one single photo, not making a composite. Okay, just check questions over here. I know Diego's picking some up. So let's see. What's the best strategy to get power lines in a sky? sometimes can be hit and miss because it really depends on the data you have to work with, because you need a source to get rid of it. So as long as you've got that source, don't feel that you need to have the same source for like one straight sweep. You can, pick a few different source points and get rid of it that way. So trial and error, I would say. Okay, let's talk about luminosity masking, and we're going to grab this picture here, not this one. Let's just reset what's going on here, so we're back to square one. So far you've seen, and this picture we're actually going to use, or we're going to try and edit it with 3 different techniques. So we're going to do it traditionally, we're going to try luminosity masking, and we're going to try the magic brush, and we're going to try a combination and see which one is the best. Because even though you have all these great tools at your disposal, sometimes a bit of a blessing and a curse, because you have to make the decision which tool works the best for that particular photo. Also, just because you have a super wonderful tool like the magic brush, which we looked at last week, or the Luma Range masking, doesn't mean you should then suddenly enthusiastically use it on every single photo, which can often be a danger. With great power comes great responsibility, of course. So we've got this photo here. It's got some basic editing onto it. There's kind of more going on in the sky. So if I pull the exposure down, there's quite a nice, interesting, dramatic sky. It would be nice if we could liberate a little bit more of that by dropping the brightness or exposure down, adding some clarity and so on. But all of those things are going to be damaging to the foreground, which is already quite a nice density. So traditionally, what would we do? Also last week, we looked at our gradient mask, which would be my first stab at adjusting this. So I'd grab my gradient cursor tool over here. I would start drawing from the top. I would hold my shift key down to keep it nice and straight. And then I would hold my option key down to make it asymmetrical, so the fall off is a little bit harder. And this is roughly probably where I want to sit it, something like that. So what I would do next is, okay, let's make this sky look more interesting. So I'm going to pull the exposure down a bit, maybe pull the brightness and the highlights down a touch too, add a bit of clarity in. Let's pull the shadows and the blacks down so this area gets a bit darker, and actually even more, I could pull the brightness down. So now we've got some nice definition in the fluffy clouds and so on. Looks better than it did before. However, this picture is a great example of the techniques that we're going to look at, is because he is unfortunately sticking his head above our horizon line. So if we turn this adjustment layer off, it's making it too dark really on his back. So we're losing definition on the back of his jacket. It's not optimal really. So how can we improve on that? Well, we have a whole bunch of choices, and we're going to name this one grad only. So if we didn't have access to luminosity masking, or we didn't have access to the magic brush, what we would have to do is manually delete parts of those masks, or the grad mask that I've just done. So if I press M on my keyboard, you can see it in red. So the way to do that would be to grab my eraser and then try to erase a little part of the mask. We're going to get this error popped up, rasterize the mask, because if you remember from last week, if you have, let's just turn the mask off, if we have our gradient tool selected, then we are able to adjust the mask. Did I actually rasterize it? Stupid me. Let's just quickly draw that in again, and I'll explain what rasterize means if you missed it. So if we want to erase part of this mask, I can't, because if you remember from last week, if we have our gradient cursor tool selected, I can always go back in and tweak and adjust it as I see fit. So if I wanted to erase a bit of it, I'd have to rasterize it first, which means kind of stick the mask as it is and treat it as if a mask I'd drawn myself, and then I could erase parts of it. So I could do that. I could grab my erase brush. I could try and erase a bit, but it's time consuming. It's messy. I'd have to be quite accurate around him. It wouldn't be a super pleasant job. So not the best way to handle it, especially when we have other tools at our disposal. So let's call that grad only, like so. And let's try a different approach. Let's use our luminosity masking. So I'm going to start with a new layer and we're going to call that Luma. And we're going to long press on plus and we're going to add a new filled adjustment layer. So that's essentially going to fill the whole photo with a mask. So again, if I press M on my keyboard, so tap M, then the mask is shown like so. So we've covered the entire picture with a mask. And now what we can do with the luminosity or the Luma Range tool is to cut out the parts of the mask that we don't want. So we only want really the top half of the picture, the brighter part of the photo. So we're going to cut out the mid-tones and the darker tones, just leaving those brighter tones. Now an easier way to visualize this is to use something called the grayscale mask, which is very handy when you're doing Luma Range masking. Because what that essentially does is hide the photo and just show you the mask expressed in tonal range of grey, essentially. So if we turn on grayscale mask, then it's going to go white because the entire photo is masked. Quite often we get support cases come in, I can't see my pictures, they're all white or they're all black. You've probably inadvertently turned on the grayscale mask, that's why. And that's also why there's a little exclamation mark at the top here. So if it happens to you, that's probably what's going on as well. So let's turn on Luma Range, like so. Oh, first of all, I'm going to turn off these layers. So I'd actually made a layer there, stupid me. What did I do? Did I make another one? So first of all, what's going on? That's our grad, this one, and that's our full layer. So let's get rid of that one and we call this one Luma. Too many layers, David. Okay, that's our gradient mask. This is our Luma, and let's turn on our grayscale mask and let's hit Luma Range and see what happens. Oh, what I wanted to do was turn off that layer so it's not interfering with the same job that we're going to do. Okay. So we want to have just the brightest parts. In the Luma Range tool, we have these 4 handles on our trapezoid here. So these are the range. So this is what part of the luminosity range do we want to show or hide. And then we've got the fall off, which is, you'll see in a second, how violent or how aggressive are we going from the in range and the out of range. So I want all the bright stuff, and then I'm going to squeeze this up. So we're going to cut out the shadows, we're going to cut out the midtones. Let's move that down a bit so we can see his head. And then we're going to get to a point where we've literally just got, back a bit, we've just got the sky, like so. Even back a bit more. So we've just got the sky, we've pretty much cut perfectly around that landscape. We're going to come back to these 2 sliders, radius and sensitivity, and see what we've got just with that basic adjustment. Now if I wanted to extend the fall off, I could pull this out or we can drop it back in. So let's go for something that's relatively aggressive and say apply. Turn off our mask with M on the keyboard and let's try and edit the sky again and see what happens. So what did we do? We pulled down the exposure a little bit. Oh, I actually forgot to adjust that one. Geez, David. So let's do the same. Let's pull down the exposure, add some contrast, add some clarity, pull down the highlights, and then we're going to compare. So let's turn that one off and go back to our Luma mask, which looks like this, and do similar adjustments. So I'm going to pull down the exposure a bit, pull down the brightness, add a bit of clarity, pull down the highlights, and so on. Now straight away you're going to look at this and think, well, that looks terrible. Yes, we've avoided our gentleman here, but we've now got this weird line. And if we turn on the mask, you can see it. We've got this weird line in between, if you like, the cutoff point of our Luma mask. So how can we get rid of that? So once again, let's look at our grayscale mask. There is a handy shortcut, Option M. Saves you time having to go up into this menu. And let's go back and refine our Luma range. So you can always go back in and tweak what's going on. And once you've set the Luma range, that doesn't mean it's over. We can always go back and adjust it as necessary. So we've got a couple of sliders under here, radius and sensitivity. This really deals with this part here. How do we handle the pixels when we're going from the stuff that we have in our luminosity range and the stuff that's out of our luminosity range? So right now it's a pretty dramatic hard stop. There's no finesse to it, if you like. So we have our sensitivity slider here, which allows us to set a bias between feathering that edge and refining that edge. But this slider will do absolutely nothing until we increase our radius. So let's throw a bit of radius in there, and let's bring our sensitivity slider let's go all the way to 0. And you can see what's happened here. We've actually feathered that edge. So if we go back and see how's that affected the image, it's kind of got rid of that hard edge, but now we've got this weird halo. No one's going to be particularly convinced when you've seen that, are they? So it doesn't look good. So once again, we can go back into, let's put our grayscale mask, back into our Luma range, and let's try the other end of the scale and increase our radius, which is essentially going to improve the quality of that edge. And we can push that up quite high, so you can actually see it starting to spread around. Let's say apply, turn our mask off and see how that looks. Not bad, it's getting better, but it's still not the most convincing adjustment, if you know what I mean. So now if we go to the gradient mask, for me, that's still the better looking result, except for screwing up this guy's back of his head. So we've still got some work to do, if you like. So if we go back into our Luma range, could we improve this at all? Could we add a bit of fall off? That might help. That actually looks a bit more convincing, and so on. But we're probably still never going to get to the point, because we've got that such, hard edge there, that people are going to be convinced. We could try bringing this back a bit, which is getting closer, but now we've ended up with a bit of a halo around him. But by tweaking those sliders, we can probably get to a result that we are happy with, but it's not without some manual labor, if you like. So let's apply that. Let's make another layer, and we're going to call this Magic Brush, because we've got, and let's turn off, don't forget to turn that off this time. So now we can try a different tool. And then what we're going to do once we've done these 3 different tests is then find the best one, and we're going to combine 2 of the techniques together to get our optimal solution. So Magic Brush, which you saw last week, let's grab our Magic Brush, which is this guy here. We're going to make sure our mask is visible. And we're going to right click and see, well, what kind of tolerance? I need it fairly low because I don't want it to bleed too much into these mountains. Refine Edge is doing a similar thing to what the Luma range is doing at the high end of the positive scale. So it's controlling how we handle that in range and out of range experience, if you like. So let's set that relatively high. So I'm going to squiggle a bit on the sky here, see what we do. Not bad. Let's fill in that cloud. Let's try filling in that cloud. That's a bit too much. Let's undo that and then drop my tolerance down and then see if I can fill in that bit. Well, I actually can't. So I'm kind of at this point, which is not dissimilar to, if you like, the very hard Luma mask that we made. So now I can try and do the same thing, pull my highlights down, pull the brightness, add a bit of clarity. Let's go exposure down as well. So not bad. So that's Magic Brush. This is where we are with Luma so far, and this is where we are with the gradation, like so. Still my favorite, if I'm honest, except for this guy. So 3 totally different approaches, 3 with varying results of success, if you like. Now, hopefully, the best outcome is using 2 of these things together. So let's go back to our gradient mask and turn this on. There's nothing to stop us from combining a gradient mask or a radial mask or a hand-drawn mask or a Magic Brush mask in addition to a Luma Range adjustment. So let's turn on our grayscale mask. So this is what it looks like right now. And let's put a Luma Range on top of that. Why not? So if you remember, we want all the bright stuff, and we're going to squeeze this up. And very nicely, we can cut our man out, probably about there. And I doubt I even have to touch radius or sensitivity. Let's see what's going on. So now if we turn our mask off, lovely. So if we turn that back on, nice gradient mask going on, looks super natural, no weird edge over the horizon line, which you wouldn't see if you and I were standing on that hillside looking at that mountain with bright light bleeding over the top of it. It's not going to stop like a hard edge on the top, is it? So we're losing some sense of realism by making it do that, by having that very precise mask. So by adding that Luma constraint to it, we've actually got that nice fall off there, which we want. We've cut out this guy very nicely, so the adjustment isn't affecting him. And we haven't really needed to fiddle around by playing with different magic brush settings, by playing with the Luma Range settings. We just did a real simple adjustment like that. I might be tempted to refine it ever so slightly, but to be honest, I don't really think it's not really worth it. It looks good as it is. And the nice thing is our gradient mask is still active as well. So you can actually pull this up and down, and then you can see it cut round those people quite nicely. So we can still have an adjustment with our Luma Range intact. So if we turn the mask off and do it, now we could pull that down if we wanted a bit more darkness going on here, but I actually quite like the brightness on the hillside all the time without affecting our man here or our lady here and not killing the exposure on the back of their coats. So out of all those three options, the fastest way to do it was actually pull a quick gradation in, add a Luma mask. If we do it again, let's make a new layer. So I've turned everything off. We're going to grab our gradient tool, or try not to deselect it. Grab our gradient tool, hold down Shift to keep it straight, hold down the Option key to just change the fall off a bit, pull down my, say, exposure, brightness a bit. Let's pull down the highlights. Let's chuck a bit of clarity in there. Maybe that's a bit aggressive. Go into my Luma Range. Probably don't even have to see the mask. And then just pull this up until I can see, there we go. It's liberating a bit of exposure on the back. Job done, like so. Without having to do any tricky fiddling, playing with sliders, adding a magic brush, you know what I mean? So that it's just a really good combination of the two. So don't forget you can do that. There's nothing to stop you doing that on a radial mask as well. So if this is not a picture where I would do a radial mask, but if we just put a Luma mask on top of that, Luma Range, and then do a similar thing, then you can also cut out a shadow and so on. So if you are darkening down the outside of a radial mask, but it's making the shadow areas too dark, there's nothing to stop you playing around with that as well. So just don't forget that they can be combined. Noticed on the Luma Range tool, sorry, on the layer where we've got our Luma Range adjustments, you can see the little sunshine, which is just telling you that you've got a Luma Range adjustment present. So if you're wondering why you might be seeing some weird artifacts or something at some point, or it's not looking how it should, then, okay, I've got Luma Range adjustment on there. Let's go in and check and see what's happening. Like so. Okay, let's find some questions. Jim says, I was thinking of the magic brush as a last resort, but it's really a first resort. Like all tools in Capture One, there's a time and a place. So the magic brush, we're going to look at example in a minute with refining and feathering masks. It would be the very first thing I use. On a situation like this, I would always go for a gradient first because of the natural look, and then modify that gradient either by raising it by hand if it was easy, or putting on a Luma Range constraint like so. Does it make, what was Ben asking? what does refine mask and soft mask edges do, or whatever they're called in English? So refine mask, so where we are going from, if you like, masked to not masked, it's how that edge transition is handled. So radius will examine more pixels from either edge of that transition, and refining it will kind of like even them out nicely between that transition. If the radius is small, then it's going to be a hard edge. If the radius is big, then it's going to be a softer edge. If you feather a mask, it just poof, makes it soft and fuzzy, out of focus, however you would like to think of it. Okay, let's look over question panel over here. We've answered those, I think. Oh, there's even an answer in Spanish. There we go. Thanks, Diego. Okay, I think we're good for questions, actually. Thanks to my colleagues. Let's move on to our last thing, actually. Oh, look. So I've got grayscale mask still open, and then you can see the cleanup like so. That's quite fun. Okay, let's make a new layer, and we're going to call this skin tone edit. So if you do have grayscale mask on, this is what can happen. You'd be thinking, why am I pictures all suddenly black? That's why, because you've turned on your grayscale mask. Okay, so now we're going to do a skin tone edit. What's going on with, oh, I managed to draw a very tiny radial mask. Let's clear that mask. That's better. And go back to our magic brush. Oh, I think there's a weird bit of healing going on. Let's just reset all those layers because it's not important for this demonstration. So what about refining and feathering separately? So let's grab our magic brush. Make sure it's turned on. Let's say we want to do a quick skin edit on our subject here, and we want to use the skin tone tool. So I just want to select the skin. So if we right click with our magic brush, let's up the tolerance a bit, and then let's just start here and see what happens. It's pretty good. So we need to add in there, a little bit there. That's great. So we've got a pretty good skin selection except for the lips, but we'll fix that in a second. If we look at our grayscale mask, and this might answer your question, Ben, let's just fill in a little bit. Also, the grayscale mask is maybe good for also seeing bits that you missed just with the normal red mask if it doesn't show up quite as easily. So if we right click on a layer, we've got feather mask and refine mask. So feather, which is 0 on our luminosity adjustment, if you like, would just simply do this. So it just soft focus almost, blurs the mask, feathers it. So it just gives us softer edges, like so, as you can see. Now refine mask, if we zoom in a bit, this mask is actually fairly refined thanks to that option in the magic brush, refine edge. So it's already doing a refine edge function, if you like. But if we right click and say refine mask more, I don't know if it will refine a great deal more, but you see, Ben, the greater the radius, you see how that mask between the transition of masked and not masked is being pushed out. So it's like a really soft fall off. If we turn that radius right down, you see it's a much harder fall off between where it's masked and where it's not masked. So if we bump that radius up, like so, and it's quite a lot to calculate, then you see it spreads out between that in mask and not masked situation. But we don't really need to do it on this shot. It's going to work just fine, I would say. Martin says the grayscale mask looks scary. Yeah, it does look a little bit scary. So what can we do with this shot? So this is just really a quick way to do a nice skin tone edit without having to do any painstaking masking. So if I go to my skin tone tool, let's just bring it out so you can see what's going on. I'm going to tell Capture One by using this picker what my target skin tone is. So let's choose this. I'm going to widen my range by covering all the potential skin tone that is on my subject. And then we can say, bring all the hue to the same uniformity. So everything within this triangle will get transformed to my picked color. So you'll see if I put the hue back to 0, if you watch the color of her lips and bring it to the right, they're now uniformed with that picked skin tone, which of course we don't want, but we'll fix that in a second. And we can do the same with saturation. Lightness will kind of ruin all the lighting, so we must use that with great care, of course. And now we can put that away. And all I would do to finish that is grab my eraser. I wouldn't even bother looking at the mask, to be honest. Make sure it's relatively soft, and then I would just brush around that area like so, and just take the mask away. Again, we don't have to be massively accurate. So if we look at our mask now, we've just essentially punched a hole in it like so. Ben was asking, in this example, how would you select the skin in the hair area between the hair? Well, what I could do, depending on our magic brush situation, let's see, did it pick it up? Let's have a look. Kind of pretty much got it, I think. Like, the only thing I would do is, in this situation, I wouldn't actually really need to pick the skin out there. But if we grab our magic brush, probably going to regret trying this now, but then pull the tolerance right down and the size relatively small and just pick a little bit in there. There we go. That's just spread out into those areas. So that's a pretty good mask of all the skin areas, I would say. And there's maybe a little bit here. Do we risk it? Let's try. Yep, there we go. So the magic brush is additive. Don't forget about that. So we've now picked out all those particular areas. To be honest, because her hair color is probably way out of what we're doing here in the color editor, it wouldn't matter so much. But if their hair color is coinciding, like blonde or something, redhead can pick up the same tones as the skin, then you might actually want to be a bit careful about including hair in the mask as well. But that actually does a pretty nice job. You can see cutting around it like so. So good question. Thanks, Ben. Oh, let's take your question off. Sorry. How are we doing for time? Pretty much there, I would say. The last thing that I would want to mention, or that I'm going to mention, is a couple of other things which we can do on this shot actually, which is copying masks. And the reason why we might want to copy a mask, again, like with having different heel layers, is having different opacities or at least a different task for each layer. So this one is our skin tone color edit. But let's say we wanted to do something else. Maybe we wanted to add some sharpness or add some softening, add a bit of grain or something like that. And we've already adjusted the opacity of this layer to the effect that we want. But we want to apply a different correction to the same mask. Rather than having to go through that entire process again, we can make a new layer and we can right click on it and we can say copy the mask from here. So that would just give me an absolutely identical mask with no adjustments. So you see everything is zeroed out. And then if I wanted to, well, if I wanted to soften it, I could pull the clarity down. If we wanted to add some sharpening, because she's got great skin, I could throw a bit more sharpening in and so on. But it does mean they can have independent opacities and share exactly the same mask. So then you don't, get conflicts on the image editing. That was already a really nice mask which selected a, skin line perfectly there. So rather than go through that process of magic brushing and punching a hole here again, we can just borrow that. And finally, if you're into using styles, let's just find some styles. Let's just scroll down this list of styles. Let's say you find a style, think that looks good, but it's a bit strong. Rather than trying to apply the style and playing with the sliders and reducing the effect, right click on it and say add it to a new layer. This is a brilliant feature, mostly because it's very difficult to get a style which works universally across all images and all image types. Sometimes it's too strong, sometimes it's not strong enough. So if we can say apply to new layer, like so, what we end up with is a style layer. And of course, like any other layer that we've been playing with, we can dial back the opacity. So whilst this is a little bit too much, probably about, here, gives us a nice look of our spring number 5 style at half strength. So it just makes any style that much more versatile. So don't forget that you can do that. It will also work on a batch. So if I selected all of these pictures and then right clicked and say add to new layer, it's going to make a style layer for every single picture. So it's also very handy in a batch as well. All right, let's let's ask a few more questions. Let's answer a few more questions, and then that will be the end of today's session. John says, what happens to the refined edge if I invert a mask? Well, good question. It would invert. The refinement would invert. So essentially when you invert a mask, you're literally just inverting the values of each pixel. So if you think of the grayscale mask as exactly that, a grayscale mask, if something is 100, it's going to become 0 and vice versa. And of course all the scales in between. So you're really just inverting the mask. The refining part of it won't change because the refinement covers the in-range stuff and the out of range stuff as well. Let's see. Dan says, not a question, but I believe we met years ago in Toronto at Larry and Sherry's. Larry said to say hi. Oh, definitely. That's a wonderful blast from the past. Larry is a fantastic photographer, and I met him diving 11 years ago to the day. That's a really funny coincidence, because 11 years ago to the day, I met those two wonderful people. So hi, Dan, and hi, Larry and Sherry. What a great coincidence. How about using a Luma Range for skin tone and then applying to other images? Yeah, Gloria, that's a great question. If you're lucky enough for the skin tone to fall into that range, let's just turn off all these layers and add a new field adjustment layer. So it looks like this. Let's do grayscale mask. Can be hit and miss, really depends on the skin tone. So skin tone is probably in the middle somewhere. So we can almost, not quite, you see, because we're going to end up with, we won't get the perfect solution. But what we could also do, let's clear that mask for a second. You can apply a Luma Range to any kind of mask you've drawn. So if you want it to tighten up, it's maybe a good way of saying it. If you just do a rough mask, again, this may or may not work, but we can try it. So if we do a rough mask like that, and then Luma Range that, then we might be able to get it to fit better. There we go. So that would work in your situation, Gloria, but the person would have to be in the same position because it's going to copy the mask and the Luma Range. So if you've got a bunch of headshots where the person hasn't moved that much, then it might work. If their skin tone is different enough from their clothing and hair and so on, then it might work. So it could be a useful way to go about it for sure. Okay, 2 more questions and then we shall call it quits. Could you refine light in the eyes using a similar process? No, if I wanted to lighten the eyes, I would just use a style brush. So I would just go to my style brushes. But I guess if you went over the top of it, possibly. So if we go for brighten, what I would do is just have a small, relatively firm brush like so. And then just lighten a little bit. Same over here. Lighten a little bit too. And then if we turn this dodge burn off, you can see that brightness there. If you were super worried, you could grab your eraser and then make sure you hadn't spilled onto the eyes around it. But I think a situation like that, you can get away with it conventionally, if that makes sense. Great. And last question. I think we're pretty much good. we've answered most of these. Marcin, will these sessions be on YouTube? Yeah, we're actually going out to YouTube now at the same time. So as soon as we shut off the broadcast, you can go back and watch it again to your heart's content. Nice tip from Morton. Last week you mentioned using a Wacom tablet. I went to check them out and found in Canada, hi Canada, the Intuos Medium was on sale at 50%. So that's a great deal. This is actually a, let's turn off Morton's comment. This is a, oh, camera's gone to sleep. Wake up, camera. Battery's probably dying. This is a medium. So you can roughly see it's almost as big as a keyboard. I would hesitate getting anything bigger for photography, in my opinion, because you're then making bigger arm movements and it's more tiring on the shoulder. I would say even a smaller tablet will actually work quite nicely as well. So it doesn't have to be enormous. And even the Wacom One, as it's known, difficult name to get right, the Wacom One is a great deal. I think that's under $100 and that would work plenty great for Capture One as well. What shortcuts do I use for my Wacom keys? Ben says none actually, which is why I think the Wacom One, the little guy, is a good deal because it's super cheap. But these express keys you see on the side, you can set them up for shortcuts. Ergonomically, I sit like this. So left hand on the keyboard, right hand with the pen. So I've got access to a whole bunch of shortcuts here. You can set these up for shortcuts as well, but ergonomically, sorry, battery's dying. I need a better USB charger for this guy, otherwise it just dies out. So sorry about that. But ergonomically, let's hide that. Ergonomically, I find it easier to have, you know, let's make this a bit bigger. So I find it easier to have hand on the keyboard, this hand on the Wacom. I find that more comfortable. The only thing I do with the pen is then I set this guy up for, let's just bring back, I set the click button on the front to scroll, so I can scroll up and down, like so, or zoom even, or scroll web pages. I use the Wacom for everything, and I set the rocker button on the other side to do a right click, and that's about it. So I don't do anything else. That's it for shortcuts, so don't feel you need to do that. All right, that's all we have time for today. I will ask you a favor. If you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, mostly because that way you'll know when we're going to go live, especially if it's like an ad hoc live session. Also, feel free to follow us on Instagram, which is just down there at Capture One Pro, and of course our other social channels like Facebook are Capture One Pro as well. As I said, this will go straight to YouTube, so if you want to watch it again, you can do so. And next week, I'm going to be doing a live session up in London with our ambassador, Paul Reefer, talking about a new service called Capture One Live. It's been in beta for a while, but it's a collaboration tool to aid you on either remote shoots that are happening in real time, or also giving your client access to a collection in Capture One that they can look at in their own time without you having Capture One open, and giving you feedback with star ratings and color tags. So that's next Wednesday at the same time. You can see me and Paul looning around in London. So take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday and the weekend when it comes. Take care now. Bye now.